and everybody was saying the same thing. There used to be bigger fish. And I was like, what? We need to do something about it. I need to understand what has happened and how we got to this point in time.
When I was 8, I went out with my great uncle in his boat off in Mercury Passage, and we caught a garbage bin full of flathead that were about 50 centimetres plus. So this is back in the 80s, and I'm sure everyone who's been fishing for a long time in Tasmania has similar stories about that. But big flathead were the norm back then.
So what do I mean by big fish? It's both the certain species that grow big, like, we talk about gropers, snappers and sharks and things like that, but also within each species we want there to be medium, small, but also large individuals.
It could be a relatively small, quote unquote, small type of fish, but within even that size, even that species, there are large fish. And those are important. And similarly, there are larger fish that tend to have bigger and bigger individuals on that population.
So we need there to be large flathead, large snappers, large moongs. So within each species we need enough big fish of that species for the population, for the fish and for the ocean to function properly.
So these big fish are being taken away from the population, and then that has, they're not able to replenish. They have some ecological consequences that can lead to, like they're slowly disappearing from there, and we start seeing less of them. And we see that this is a global pattern that is happening across different regions with different social backgrounds and different cultural backgrounds as well.
Yeah, so there's a really famous study back in the 90s by a scientist called Daniel Pauly and a bunch of collaborators that was called Fishing Down Food Webs. And the idea was that all of the big species at the top of the food chain were fished first, and then they fished their way from the big predators down the way to the herbivores last, and really it had a lot of impact, that paper. But I think from what we see these days, it's not necessarily that people were targeting the fish that are at the top of the food chain, they're moving down the food chain. It's just that the big ones get taken out first. And so we do see that serial depletion. Basically, the big fish get taken down, then the next size, and then the next size. And so we get a progressively smaller average size of fish in the sea. That's the way that we've seen it in reefs.
The average size from an amateurish perspective has decreased, and that's just due to fishing pressure. It's as simple as that.
When I first started, when I was 11 years old and going up to when I was about 30, the blue grouper were everywhere. They were very prolific. Not only were they incredibly friendly, they were really large animals.
40 years ago, there was absolutely no problem in going for a scuba dive and picking up 5 crays within licence, no problem at all. Pick the size you want routine.
When I moved down to Tassie 10 years later, I was catching 35 centimetre flathead and thinking they were quite big. And then things have changed. So I know there was a lot of uproar. There was a lot of discomfort from recreational fishers when the size limits were changed, because it meant that fewer were available to them. Back in the day, it wouldn't have made a difference. There'd be just as many available to you. I think that the pressure on them has just grown so much. And
there has been a substantial decline on the fish size over time, and then we have cases, for example, local cases as the flathead here in Tassie, where there used to be really, really large catches, like 7-8 pounds, like really large ones.
I grew up that, how long did it take to bag out on flathead? That's something, that was the measurement.
I do remember going out as a kid with my family, and we would just catch flathead after flathead. We'd have quite a big family, so it did feed all of us.
Now they're still there, the flathead, but they occur at so much more smaller sizes. So what has happened? How did we get here?
A lot of the fish I do see occasionally that were around very prolifically, very small, things like blue groper and banded mowong, they were not only in big numbers, but they were very big animals. Now you're very lucky to see what we would have called a juvenile. We wouldn't have even speared or taken them out of the water back in the day.
You know, even in my life, it was looked at like this endless, infinite resource that we could just keep taking from. And even in my lifetime, I've seen these declines, and it's impossible to have grown up around the ocean and to have not seen that change.
People tend to target the bigger animals in the population and catch them. And so you see a downward trend in the actual size of the fish that are there, which has a number of long-term consequences.
There used to be lots of big fish in the ocean, lots, but we ate them. We ate them all, or most of them. And that has been happening mostly for the last 100 years, and we think that it stopped happening, but actually that's not true. Even over the last 30 years, our ability to catch this biggest fish has been improving all the time.
So the advent of the technology improvement is just astronomical and has absolutely fine-tuned the fishing effort to the ultimate. So a GPS fix, oh, we found a rock, middle of nowhere, got it again next day, next year. And the sheer numbers of people, like Tassie has one of the highest, if not the highest, boat ownerships, recreational, of anywhere in the country. So I mean, basically the idea is if you don't own a boat, 1 in 4 guys will have access or own a boat. So the fishing pressure along our coast is extremely high. Yeah.
Why are big fish important? Well, I can think of a couple of reasons why big fish are important, and one of them is probably more similar to what other people think of, and that's in terms of reproduction, and the other one is in terms of the ecology, the role that they play in the ecosystem.
Well, the bigger the fish, the more eggs they lay, and not just a little bit more, a lot more. It turns out that as the fish get somewhat bigger, their egg production can increase exponentially.
So compare a female that's 60 pounds to a female that's 4 pounds of the same species. It's 15 times the size, but it has 28 times more eggs.
So if you lose a lot of the larger breeding females in a population, you can have quite drastic consequences.
So we need those eggs because most eggs actually don't survive. And the more eggs we get, the more better eggs we get.
So the bigger the crayfish, the more, that's an example, the more eggs that they produce. And not only that, the viability of the eggs apparently is more viable. They're stronger, bigger, more healthy eggs.
Because there is also new evidence showing that the bigger fish actually also produce usually bigger eggs with more food reserves. So that is important for the fish populations.
In terms of the ecology, the big fish play a very unique role.
By removing all the big fish, we're actually removing predators in the ecosystem. And we know what happens when the ecosystem loses its predators. It gets out of balance. We get urchin invasions, we get sea stars, we get jellyfish and other things, all the things overtaking the ecosystem.
In particular, we've seen it with things like invasive sea urchins, where we just lack large fish here that are capable of tackling them. So once they get to a certain size, they literally have no predators. And in fish, I would include things like the commercially fished rock lobster and things like that. You've removed the large rock lobsters, which are one of the main predators on sea urchins and things and creatures like this. And so the result is that you end up with a population that becomes totally unbalanced. And unfortunately, any marine environment where you get sea urchins start to dominate it, the result is usually devastation for the environment, with urchin barrens forming, and they can be very difficult to correct. And even if you do, there's no guarantee it's going to come back to what it was before.
they only become predators when they are big. A small fish predator is not a predator very often. They feed on other things similar that other small fish feed. So unlike in terrestrial, unlike on land, where small tigers still are predators, small fish are not predators very often.
Because we don't fully understand a lot of the food chains that we have here, removing a large fish predator, you don't really understand what's going to happen about all of the ones down the chain, and often it can be completely unexpected.
So the other thing that big fish is doing is it's influencing the behaviour of all of the other smaller fish that are scared of it at the same time. So you might have fish that instead of being out there feeding on the turf, they're hiding in a hole when that big fish is around too. So it's having a behavioural influence on the things around it too. So that one big fish can play a really important role in the whole dynamics of that patch of reef.
Fish, like many animals, are also social creatures. They actually learn from each other. But there is more and more evidence that for a lot of fish that are actually, let's say, schooling, those older individuals, old big individuals, play a really big role in social behavior of the school. Young fish learn from the older fish and learn all sorts of social behavior, but also where to spawn and how to feed and many things. That's not necessarily proven in all species. So within each species we need enough big fish of that species for the population, for the fish and for the ocean to function properly.
(1988), Bird Rock. I think the whole dive I saw 2 crows, and I went back in August or whatever, or October last year, 23. So what's that, nearly 40 years? And the difference was astounding. Now everybody that goes diving knows that you dive around Bird Rock now, there's crows just lined up all along under the rocks. And the fish numbers were astounding compared to 40 or 35 years ago.
So is it all doom and gloom? At the moment, in many cases it is. A lot of big fish are disappearing, but there are also positive cases. Some communities took action and they see changes happening. They see big fish coming back. Because the good thing about fish is that actually they grow pretty fast. And if we do something right now, in our lifetimes, in 10, 20, 30 years, we could see things changing a lot. But if we don't do things right now, we could also see things changes to the worst direction in our lifetimes. So it's all in our hands. What are we going to do? What kind of actions are we going to take?
I fish less. If I've got enough fish for a feed, I'll stop fishing. I don't feel the need to just continue because I've spent the fuel to get out there. I'm just happy to be out there and to experience what we've got on our doorstep.
So when I'm out fishing and I guess selecting what I want to take and catch and all that, very early on it was all about the biggest and the best and getting that Instagram photo. But more recently I've realised that if you get the adequate seafood for what you're doing on that day is a lot better. For instance, we don't need a massive crayfish for 2 people. I prefer to get like the smaller ones for 2 people.
It's important to have size limits because we need to protect the big spawning fish, but overall the key lesson I think I've learned is that I have to be more conservative with the way I harvest fish than what the management allows. So size limits and bag limits for me, I don't even go close to, I'll greatly, make sure that I'm more conservative. And that's just because of what I've seen, and because I know that it's very hard for managers to manage. It's a very tough problem because they don't know how many fish are being taken out, and we don't know how many fish are in the sea. It's how we're meant to manage that effectively.
But it's how we fish. Do we need to go for every fish? Do we need to catch just more and more and more? Or do we actually want to think, how much do I actually really need? And do I really need to take that fish? I might actually catch and release it, for example, in some cases, release it safely. A lot of fish, if they're released properly, they survive quite well. I might release the big fish and protect them. Maybe I don't want to catch from the deepest areas because fish don't survive quite as well when they're pulled out from the deep. So fishers could actually be the best advocate for ocean conservation and for the fish populations, because if we restore the populations, if there is lots of big fish, everybody will benefit.
But for me, I guess it's really about a mixed bag. You know, there's no need to go and target one thing, get my bag limit, get the biggest possible. For me, that just doesn't make sense when I could leave it out there to reproduce and to provide more fish for me, my friends and my family in the future.
That's part of our role as recreational fishers too, is to understand the impact that we have on the system, and that, you know, removing that one big fish is, you know, it's only one fish, and somebody's going to do it if you don't, perhaps, you might think, but it's an important thing to understand. And that's one of the reasons why marine parks, marine reserves, even though a lot of recreational fishers don't support them, they're actually really important in that sense, because if we can remove all of the fishing pressure, it's the only way you can protect those really big fish. You just don't get the really big fish if there's a tiny bit of fishing pressure.
Well, what I would suggest, and I know it's pretty out there, is to have little areas that are left alone. It doesn't have to be half the coast of Tasmania, just little pockets.
Marine reserves can have a great effect if you have a comprehensive range of marine reserves in all environments around the coastline. Doesn't mean you have to have everything protected, but if you've got a nice representative range of reserves, if you end up with fish that are building up within the marine reserve, they will spill over and help repopulate areas around. If you lack that reserve population, it's very difficult for those species to become re-established in an area when a population is removed.
It's only a little bit of fishing pressure that removes most of the biomass, and it has the greatest ecological impact. So the big fish are really disproportionately vulnerable to being removed, and they're actually disproportionately important in the system. So it really is that first bit of fishing pressure that does the most damage.
The next step, beyond what's been done for the last umpteen decades, is to step up the protection of the areas.
They're actually critical for good management of our recreational fisheries, and I know it takes up space that people would be wanting to fish in, and I've had to accept that some places I want to fish, I can't, but instead I'll dive and really enjoy seeing the fish. You know, that's a great way to still get the benefits of a marine reserve. You know, they can benefit our fisheries management if they're done well and used in that way, but they can also benefit me still or anyone that wants to dive in there and experience the big fish, because it's phenomenal swimming with big fish still.